Mark had always dreamed of owning a cabin far away from the noise and rush of the city. After years of working long hours and saving every penny, he finally bought a modest cabin nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pine trees and the gentle hum of nature. It wasn't a grand place, but to Mark, it was perfect. A sanctuary where he could disconnect, breathe, and simply be himself. The cabin sat at the edge of a small neighborhood, one of those places where everyone knew each other by name but rarely intruded. The homes were spaced out, separated by thick forests and winding gravel roads. It was peaceful, calm, and exactly what Mark wanted. He spent most weekends at the cabin, waking up to the sound of birdsong, drinking coffee on the porch while watching the mist rise over the trees and hiking trails that twisted through the hills. Life there felt simple, uncomplicated, and honest. It was a break from the endless buzz of emails, meetings, and deadlines. One Saturday morning, as Mark was sipping his coffee, he noticed a letter lying on the porch step. It wasn't unusual for him to get mail, but this one stood out. The envelope was plain white, addressed to him, but the sender was the Homeowners Association, or HOA, as most people called it. Mark had barely paid attention to the HOA since moving in. They sent occasional newsletters or reminders about maintenance. Nothing that ever felt important or threatening. Curious, he tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter. The words inside caught him off guard. "Dear Mr. Thompson," it began. "It has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that your cabin does not comply with the community guidelines. You are required to vacate the property within 30 days. Mark blinked and reread the sentence. Vacate the property. Within 30 days, his heart started to race. What could this possibly mean? He had never received any complaints, no warnings, no phone calls. The cabin was exactly as it had been when he bought it. The letter was signed by Susan, the president of the HOA. Mark remembered seeing her at one meeting. A woman with sharp eyes and a firm voice who seemed to run things with confidence. He had assumed she was just someone who cared about keeping the neighborhood tidy. But now, her words felt cold and final. He sat back in his chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Who was Susan to decide he had to leave his own cabin? What could have possibly changed? Mark felt a mixture of confusion and frustration. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was this some kind of mistake? Did someone have it in for him? Or was there some rule he had overlooked? He decided to keep the letter and not say anything to his few neighbors just yet. This wasn't something he could handle lightly. The cabin was more than just a weekend retreat. It was his sanctuary, his safe place. That afternoon, Mark tried to call Susan, but she didn't answer. He left a message, calm but firm, asking for clarification. The only response he got was a curt email saying the decision was final and that further details would be discussed at the next HOA meeting. The days that followed were tense. Mark found himself distracted at work, anxious about the cabin and what might happen next. He kept looking at the letter, hoping for some kind of explanation to suddenly appear, but there was none. On the morning of the HOA meeting, Mark drove down the winding road to the community hall, the letter tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would Susan repeat her demands in front of everyone? Would the neighbors support her? As he walked into the room, he noticed the familiar faces of some neighbors, some curious, some wary. Susan was already there, sitting confidently at the head of the table, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Mark took a deep breath and sat down, knowing this was only the beginning. Whatever happened next, he was ready to stand his ground. The cabin was his, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away without a fight. The morning sun filtered through the tall pines as Mark pulled into the small parking lot beside the community hall. His heart thumped with a mix of nerves and determination. Today was the HOA meeting, the place where Susan, the president, planned to explain why she wanted him to leave his cabin. The letter had shaken him more than he cared to admit, and now he had to face the woman behind it. Inside, the room buzzed quietly with neighbors chatting in low voices. Mark scanned the faces. Some looked curious, others seemed cautious. He spotted a few familiar ones who often waved when he walked by on the trail, but mostly, the room was filled with strangers. The kind of strangers who only came to these meetings when something big was happening. Susan sat at the head of the table, poised and collected as always. She wore a crisp blouse, and her hair was pulled back tightly. Her eyes met Mark's, for a brief moment, sharp and unreadable. Then she turned her attention to the papers in front of her, signaling the start of the meeting. When it was her turn to speak, Susan's voice was steady and clear. "We've had some concerns about compliance with the neighborhood guidelines," she began. "Mr. Thompson's cabin has been reviewed, and it was determined that the property does not meet the current standards." She didn't elaborate much, assuming the letter had already said enough. Mark listened, trying to keep his face calm, but inside, he was boiling. He had lived there for years without a single complaint. How could this be true? What standards was she talking about? When Susan finished, the floor was open for questions. Mark raised his hand and stood up. "I'm Mark Thompson. I received the letter about vacating my cabin. I'm confused about what exactly I'm being asked to do. Can you please explain what's wrong with my property?" There was a brief pause, and Susan's expression didn't waver. "The guidelines require all properties to maintain certain standards regarding appearance, maintenance, and use," she said. "Unfortunately, your cabin does not meet those requirements." Mark frowned. "I've kept the cabin in good shape. I've never been told otherwise." "Can you tell me specifically what I need to fix or change?" Susan glanced at her notes. "There are issues with permits, landscaping, and some structural concerns. These have been documented." Mark's mind raced. He had never received any notices or warnings about permits or landscaping. The small deck was sturdy, and the trees around the cabin were untouched. "I haven't received any notices about these issues before. Why is this coming up now?" Susan shrugged slightly. "The board has been reviewing all properties recently. We want to ensure the neighborhood remains a place everyone can enjoy." The room murmured quietly. Some neighbors nodded, others looked uncertain. Mark noticed a few glances in his direction that seemed sympathetic, feeling a surge of frustration. But determined to stay composed, Mark said, "I'd appreciate it if you could provide the documentation. I want to understand everything fully so I can address any concerns." Susan nodded, but her tone was firm. "The board has made its decision. The timeline for vacating the property stands." That phrase echoed in Mark's mind. Vacate the property. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He left the meeting with more questions than answers and a heavy weight in his chest. Back at the cabin, Mark sat on the porch, staring at the towering pines. He thought about how peaceful everything had seemed just days before. Now, the peace was shattered by a letter and a meeting filled with vague accusations. Determined not to give up, Mark decided to take a closer look at the situation. He began planning to review public records and property documents, if there was any mistake or misunderstanding. He wanted to find it. That night, he stayed up late, searching through county websites and old files. The more he dug, the more he realized how little he actually knew about the property's history and legal details. Mark didn't realize it yet, but this unexpected challenge was about to uncover secrets that would change everything. Secrets about ownership, control, and the true power dynamics in the neighborhood. As he finally closed his laptop, exhaustion creeping in, Mark knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let a surprise letter take away the cabin he loved without a fight. The days after the HOA meeting passed in a blur for Mark. His mind was tangled with questions and doubts. But one thing was clear. He couldn't accept Susan's decision without understanding more. He needed answers, and, more importantly, he needed to stand up for himself. One crisp morning, Mark drove down the gravel road toward the community hall again. This time, he wasn't going for a meeting, but for a direct conversation. He wanted to speak with Susan one-on-one, away from the watchful eyes of the neighbors. If there was any chance to settle things quietly, now was the moment. When Mark arrived, Susan was already there, organizing papers on the small wooden desk. Her posture was as rigid as ever, and her expression unreadable. Mark took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hi, Susan," Mark began, keeping his voice steady. "I wanted to talk about the letter and the meeting. I need to understand what's really going on." Susan looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Thompson, this is a community matter. It's best handled during the meetings." Mark nodded, but pressed on. "I get that, but the letter was a shock. I've never heard of any issues with the cabin before. I'm sure there's some kind of mistake." Susan's lips pressed together. "The board has reviewed the records thoroughly. The decision is final." Mark frowned. "I'm not asking to debate the decision. I just want specifics. What exactly is wrong? I want to fix anything if I can." For a moment, Susan's expression softened. "There have been concerns about permits and property boundaries. Also, some neighbors have mentioned issues with landscaping." Mark raised his eyebrows. "Neighbors? I haven't heard a single complaint until now. And permits? I've kept everything above board. I'd like to see any documentation about this." Susan shifted uncomfortably. "The records are with the board secretary. If you want to review them, you can request a copy." Mark nodded. "Thank you. I will." Susan glanced around the room as if expecting someone to appear, then sighed. "Look, Mark, this isn't personal. We just want to maintain the neighborhood standards." Mark studied her for a moment. There was something about her tone that felt rehearsed. Like she was saying what she thought she should, not what she really believed. "Tell me, Susan," Mark said quietly, "have you ever been to my cabin? Walked the property, seen how I've taken care of it?" Susan hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I haven't." Mark was surprised. "Then how can you be so sure?" Susan didn't answer. There was a sudden knock on the door, and a neighbor peered in. "Susan, the meeting is about to start," the neighbor said softly. Susan stood up. "We'll continue this later." Mark watched her go, feeling a strange mix of frustration and curiosity. Why was she so quick to push him out without a proper look? That afternoon, Mark sat in the cabin's living room, flipping through some of the documents he had already managed to gather. Titles, deeds, old property maps, nothing seemed out of place. But something still didn't add up. He called a friend who was a local real estate agent to help him make sense of the papers. Over the phone, the agent suggested checking county records for any recent changes or unusual transfers. Mark agreed as he searched deeper. A surprising detail caught his eye. The land records showed that he owned not only the cabin, but also the surrounding land, including the plots nearby. A chill ran down his spine. Could it be that the very ground Susan's house was built on was also his? Mark shook his head, thinking it was a mistake. But the more he looked, the clearer it became. He might hold the title to more than just his cabin's lot. This revelation sparked a new wave of determination. If Susan didn't even know about the land she lived on, what else was hidden beneath the surface of this quiet neighborhood? Mark realized this was no longer just about his cabin. 'Twas about understanding who really controlled the land and how that power had been overlooked or ignored all this time. With renewed purpose, Mark began to plan his next steps. He would gather more information, talk to experts, and prepare for whatever came next. Whatever Susan thought, he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Mark woke up with a restless energy. The discovery from the day before echoed in his mind, the land records suggesting he might own more than just his cabin's lot. It didn't make sense. How could Susan and the HOA be unaware of such an important detail? And why had this ownership? Information never been mentioned before. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mark headed to the county recorder's office. It was a modest building tucked away near the town center, filled with rows of filing cabinets and busy clerks. He hoped that this visit would bring clarity, and maybe even answers to the strange situation he found himself in. At the front desk, Mark explained what he was looking for: detailed property records, historical deeds, anything that would show who owned what in the neighborhood. The clerk was helpful, guiding him to a section of old maps and documents that weren't digitized. For the next several hours, Mark sifted through yellowed papers, scanned maps, and typed copies. The deeper he went, the more he realized how tangled the records were. Some plots had been sold, subdivided, and transferred multiple times over decades. Yet one thread remained consistent. Mark's name, or rather the legal entity he had registered when he purchased the cabin, appeared on documents covering more land than just the cabin's footprint. Among the documents, Mark found a detailed survey from years before he bought the property. It showed boundaries that included the neighboring lots, the very area where Susan's house now stood. Confused, Mark cross-referenced that with more recent records. To his astonishment, the land under Susan's home and several surrounding cabins was listed under his ownership. He sat back, stunned. How could Susan be unaware of this? Had the HOA leadership never checked the official deeds, or was there something else at play? Mark knew he needed expert advice, so he contacted a real estate attorney recommended by his friend. The attorney, Mrs. Ellis, was sharp and experienced. With a reputation for untangling complicated property matters, they met the next day at Mark's cabin, where he laid out all the documents he had collected. Mrs. Ellis flipped through the papers. "Thoughtfully, based on what you've shown me," she said slowly, "it looks like you own the underlying land. The fee, simple interest, which means you technically own the soil and everything attached to it. If the homes on that land, including Susan's, were built without a proper lease or agreement, that's a significant issue." Mark frowned. "But the HOA has been managing things as if the land belonged to the homeowners, not me. How is that possible?" "It's unusual," Mrs. Ellis replied. "Sometimes land is held by one party and others own the buildings on top under lease agreements or other arrangements. But if those agreements don't exist or have expired, the landowner has more control than people realize." Mark's mind buzzed. "So Susan could be living on land that I own?" "Yes, it seems that way. You need to verify if there are any lease agreements or contracts in place. If not, you may have more rights than you thought." Mark leaned forward. "What should I do next?" "Gather every document you can find about the HOA's land management. Talk to neighbors, see if anyone knows about leases or contracts, and don't make any decisions without legal advice. This can get complicated." Mark nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and caution. The cabin that had seemed so simple now held secrets he never expected. The power balance in the neighborhood was not what it appeared to be. That evening, Mark sat on his porch, staring out at the darkening woods. The peaceful world he had known was shifting beneath him, and he realized that understanding the truth was only the beginning. What would he do with this knowledge? How would Susan react when she found out? For now, Mark decided to keep this discovery to himself. He needed more facts before anyone else knew. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about something much bigger, something hidden in plain sight. As the stars twinkled overhead, Mark felt a spark of determination. The quiet retreat he loved was about to become the stage for a story far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Mark knew he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than a simple property dispute. The discovery about the land ownership had opened a door he never expected to find, a door leading to hidden power and unexpected leverage, but he wasn't ready to storm through it just yet. Instead, Mark took a step back and began preparing quietly. He reached out to his attorney, Mrs. Ellis, and together they mapped out a careful plan. No sudden moves, no public confrontations at Newcons. At least not until Mark was fully ready. For days, Mark pored over every document he could find. County records, old contracts, HOA meeting minutes, and property maps filled his dining table. He even spoke to a few neighbors casually, trying to feel out what they knew about the land and its history. The more he learned, the clearer it became that the HOA had been operating under a false assumption, or maybe even an unspoken secret. The land belonged to Mark and Susan, the HOA president. Kay had been unaware she was living on his property all along. This quiet preparation wasn't just about gathering papers. It was about understanding the full scope of his rights and options. Could he ask Susan and the others to pay rent? Did he want to? Could he change the HOA's leadership? Or would it be better to use this knowledge as a shield, a way to protect his cabin from eviction threats? Mark didn't have the answers yet, but he knew the right time to act would come. Meanwhile, Susan continued her public campaign, sending more letters and holding meetings about neighborhood standards. But Mark stayed calm. He avoided confrontations, knowing that any rash reaction might give away the advantage he was building. One afternoon, while digging deeper in the records, Mark stumbled upon an old agreement buried in the files, a lease from decades ago. It seemed the original landowner had leased plots to homeowners, including the one Susan's house was built on. But the lease had expired years earlier, and no new agreements had been signed since. That discovery explained a lot. Susan's house was technically on Mark's land, but neither of them had realized it. The HOA had been managing the neighborhood, as if it owned the land collectively, but legally. The facts were different. With this new piece of information, Mark felt more confident, but also more cautious. This was a delicate situation, and how he handled it could change everything. Late one evening, Mark sat on his porch, the forest quiet around him. He thought about the upcoming HOA meeting where Susan was likely to bring up the eviction again. He had to be ready, not just with facts, but with a strategy. He decided to invite Mrs. Ellis to join him at the next meeting. Having a legal expert present might change how the HOA handled things, especially if Susan still didn't realize what was at stake. Mark also planned to talk to some of the neighbors he trusted, quietly sharing parts of the story. He hoped to build some quiet support before the situation escalated. Through it all, Mark reminded himself why he had bought the cabin in the first place. Not just for the escape, but for the peace and freedom it gave him. He wasn't going to lose that without a fight. But he also didn't want to turn this into a war. This was about fairness, about clarity, and about standing his ground with calm confidence as the stars shimmered above the towering trees. Mark felt a sense of purpose settle over him. Whatever happened next, he would face it prepared, patient, and steady. The day of the next HOA meeting arrived with a soft drizzle falling through the pine trees. Mark arrived early, the letter from the previous meeting folded neatly in his pocket, and Mrs. Ellis by his side. She had agreed to come. Sensing this wasn't just a routine neighborhood disagreement, the community hall felt more crowded this time. Rumors had spread that Mark was challenging the board's decision, and several neighbors showed up out of curiosity. Susan was already there, sitting confidently, as always. But Mark noticed a slight tension in her shoulders. When the meeting began, Susan wasted no time. "We're here to discuss the continued non-compliance issues regarding Mr. Thompson's cabin," she said firmly. The board stands by its decision. Mark waited patiently as Susan laid out the same vague concerns, permits, landscaping, and property boundaries. Then, when the room quieted, Mark stood and spoke. "Before we move forward, I want to share something important with everyone." He took a deep breath and gestured to Mrs. Ellis. "This is my attorney, Mrs. Ellis. Together, we've reviewed the property records. The truth is, the land beneath not just my cabin, but several other properties, including Susan's, belongs to me." The room murmured in surprise. Susan's confident expression flickered for the first time. Mark continued. "There was an old lease agreement that expired years ago. Since then, the land ownership hasn't been updated or addressed properly. The HOA has been operating under assumptions that don't match the legal facts." He unfolded several documents on the table: property deeds, survey maps, and the expired lease. "These papers show that I hold the title to this land." The silence was thick. Neighbors exchanged glances, some whispering softly. Susan finally spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "I wasn't aware of this." Mark nodded. "Neither was I, until recently. That's why I'm here, to clear the air and find a way forward that respects everyone's rights." Mrs. Ellis added, "This is a complicated situation, but it's one that can be resolved fairly if the community works together. I'm here to help facilitate those conversations." A few neighbors raised hands with questions, curious about what this meant for their homes and the HOA's future. Mark answered, as best as he could, always staying calm and respectful. Susan, meanwhile, seemed to be processing the news. Her earlier firmness softened into something more thoughtful. After the questions settled, Mark suggested, "Perhaps it's time to revisit how the neighborhood manages land and property. Clear agreements, transparent records, and open communication could prevent confusion like this in the future." The room slowly warmed to the idea. The tension that had filled the air just weeks before began to lift. As the meeting wrapped up, Susan approached Mark quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said, a hint of apology in her voice. "I just wanted to protect the neighborhood." Mark smiled. "I understand, and I want that too. Maybe now we can work together." Walking out into the damp afternoon, Mark felt a sense of relief and hope. The truth was out, and with it came new possibilities. The cabin in the woods wasn't just a retreat anymore. It was a symbol of patience, discovery, and standing firm when it mattered most. In the days following the meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. The revelation about the land ownership had stirred conversations. Quiet whispers that spread from porch to porch and along the winding paths between the cabins. Mark noticed a subtle change when he walked around. Neighbors who once glanced his way with suspicion now nodded or smiled. Some even stopped to chat, curious about what the future might hold. It was clear the dynamic was evolving, slowly but surely. Susan, too, reached out. She invited Mark over for coffee at her cabin one morning, wanting to talk in a more relaxed setting. Mark wasn't sure what to expect, but he accepted. Inside her cozy home, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor. Susan poured coffee and sat across from Mark, her expression more open than he had seen in months. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she began, "about the land and the leases. I realize now how much we've all been operating on assumptions." Mark nodded. "It's easy to overlook the details when you've lived somewhere for years. The paperwork can get complicated, and sometimes no one looks closely." Susan sighed. "I want to make this right, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. We've built this community together, and I don't want to see it divided." The conversation opened a door between them. They talked about possibilities, updating leases, setting clear agreements, and working together to strengthen the neighborhood. Susan admitted she hadn't fully understood the legal side of things, but was willing to learn and help. Mark appreciated her honesty. "I want to help too. This is about more than just my cabin. It's about making sure everyone feels secure and respected." Over the next few weeks, Mark and Susan met several times. They drafted letters to the HOA board, suggesting ways to clarify land ownership and lease agreements. They planned community meetings where an attorney could explain the legal aspects to everyone. Their partnership surprised some neighbors, but it also inspired confidence. Slowly, others joined the effort. People who had once kept their distance now offered ideas and support. One afternoon, a group of homeowners gathered at Mark's cabin. They sat around a fire pit, sharing stories and concerns. The conversation was honest, open, and hopeful. Mark realized this was what the neighborhood needed, a fresh start built on transparency and trust. Meanwhile, Susan's leadership took on a new tone. She began encouraging collaboration and making efforts to listen more carefully. The change was not immediate, but it was real. Mark felt proud of how far things had come. What had started as a conflict was turning into a chance to strengthen the community. Still, Mark kept a watchful eye. There were details to iron out and legal matters to address. But now, he wasn't alone. Together with Susan and the neighbors, he was ready to build something better, a place where everyone's rights and voices mattered. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabins, Mark felt a quiet satisfaction. The journey wasn't over, but the path ahead was clearer. For the first time in a long while, the cabin felt like home again. Not just his retreat, but part of a community that could grow stronger together. The following weeks unfolded with a steady rhythm of meetings, conversations, and cooperation. Mark, Susan, and the other homeowners worked closely with Mrs. Ellis and a few other professionals to rewrite the neighborhood's agreements and update the land leases. For many, the process was eye-opening. It revealed years of misunderstandings and missed opportunities, but it also sparked a shared commitment to do better. The group worked tirelessly to ensure the new documents were clear, fair, and designed to protect everyone's interests. At the next HOA meeting, held in the freshly cleaned community hall, the changes were presented. The revised agreements included detailed land leases, clear guidelines on property improvements, and a commitment to transparency in all future board decisions. Neighbors listened attentively, and when the vote was called, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Susan, now more approachable and candid, addressed the crowd. "This community means a lot to all of us. I'm grateful for the chance to move forward with openness and respect. Together, we've turned a difficult situation into an opportunity." Mark felt a swell of pride. His quiet determination had sparked real change that would protect his cabin, his neighbors' homes, and the community's future. The tension that had once clouded the neighborhood lifted, replaced by a sense of unity and possibility. Life returned to a peaceful rhythm. Mark continued to enjoy the solitude of his cabin, but now with the knowledge that his place in the community was secure. Occasionally, Susan and he would share a wave or a friendly word when they crossed paths on the winding trails. The story of the eviction letter. Once a source of anxiety became a turning point, a lesson in patience, persistence, and the power of truth. Mark knew challenges could arise again. But he was confident that with honesty and cooperation, the neighborhood could face anything. As the seasons changed, the cabin stood, quietly nestled among the trees, a symbol of resilience and new beginnings. Mark smiled to himself one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm hues across the sky. The journey had been unexpected and sometimes difficult, but in the end, it brought clarity and community, a new chapter he was ready to embrace.